17-year-old Caleb Turner had been locked in county jail for 8 long months on charges that made no sense, until the day Detective Cole Maddox stormed into federal court and attacked Judge Raine in front of everyone. What happened next exposed a criminal network across 3 states and changed everything. Stay tuned, subscribe, like, and share this story so the truth reaches every corner of the country. The air in Federal Courtroom 6A that morning carried the kind of tension you could taste, sharp and metallic, like a penny pressed to the tongue. It was just past 9 o'clock, sunlight pouring through the tall, arched windows, turning the polished oak panels into walls of gold. Rows of heavy benches creaked under the weight of a packed gallery. Attorneys, journalists, curious citizens, and the quiet presence of Caleb Turner's mother, Danielle, clutching a worn manila folder to her chest. The room's stillness was punctuated only by the soft shuffle of papers and the rhythmic ticking of the courthouse clock. Judge Raine sat poised behind the elevated bench, her black robe falling in precise folds, silver-rimmed glasses balanced on her nose as she reviewed the final page of the habeas corpus petition. Caleb Turner, just 17 years old, sat at the defendant's table in his ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, shackles clinking faintly when he shifted. His expression was careful, controlled in the way of someone who knew that even breathing too loudly could be taken as defiance in a place like this. Then the doors burst open. They didn't swing, they slammed. Brass hinges groaned in protest as they were forced beyond their usual arc, and every head in the courtroom snapped toward the sound. Detective Cole Maddox filled the doorway like a dark storm rolling into a clear sky. At 6'4", with the solid build of a man who had once worn combat fatigues, his silhouette was framed in the light from the corridor. He moved with the entitled momentum of someone who had never been denied access to anything in his life. The dark blue of his uniform was cut sharp, decorated with service ribbons and commendations that, to the casual observer, spoke of heroism and sacrifice. But to those who knew his reputation, they were more like warning labels. Maddox's boots struck the marble floor with heavy, deliberate steps, each one echoing like the countdown to an explosion. He didn't acknowledge the court clerk's startled protests or the bailiff's stiffening posture. His pale green eyes swept the room, scanning, calculating, assessing like a predator finding his prey. When his gaze landed on Judge Raine, something flickered in his expression, a shadow of contempt, quickly masked by a smirk that curled his lips into a shape both confident and cruel. "You don't belong on that bench," he snarled, his voice cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "You Constitution-loving fraud." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The bailiff took a step forward, but Judge Raine raised one hand, palm outward, stopping him without breaking her gaze from Maddox. She'd seen that look before. The barely restrained hostility of men who believed authority came from the weight of their fists and the shadow of their badges, not from law or principle. "Detective Maddox," she said evenly, her voice carrying a calm that only heightened the tension. "You are disrupting a federal proceeding. Take your seat or leave this courtroom." He didn't sit. He didn't leave. He crossed the space between them in a slow, deliberate stride, the kind of approach meant to unsettle, to prove dominance without saying another word. The gallery was holding its collective breath now, the silence so deep you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. Then it happened. Maddox's hand shot forward, not toward his weapon, but toward the polished wooden gavel resting on the bench before Judge Raine. The movement was swift, practiced, not the clumsy grab of an angry man, but the precise reach of someone who'd done violence before. His fingers wrapped around the handle, knuckles whitening as he lifted it high above his head. For an instant, time fractured. The gavel seemed suspended in the air, sunlight glinting off its smooth surface, the emblem of judicial authority transformed into a weapon. Federal cameras mounted in the corners whirred softly, their lenses narrowing to capture every frame. Judge Raine's eyes never left his. She didn't flinch, didn't lean back. "This is what happens," Maddox roared, "when you forget your place." The gavel came down in a vicious arc. The crack of wood against flesh exploded in the chamber, loud as a gunshot. Blood bloomed instantly on Judge Raine's forehead, a bright crimson mark against her pale skin. The impact staggered her, but she remained upright, one hand braced against the bench, the other clutching the edge as though anchoring herself to the very foundation of the law. The room erupted. The bailiff lunged forward. Federal agents, who had been stationed unobtrusively near the exits, moved in perfect coordination. Shouts overlapped, the agents calling commands, the gallery exclaiming in disbelief, Caleb Turner's mother crying out her son's name without even realizing it. But through it all, Judge Raine's voice rose, steady and cold. "Let the record show," she said, blood tracing a line down her temple, "that Detective Cole Maddox has physically assaulted a sitting federal judge in open court during constitutional proceedings." The words cut through the chaos like a siren. Maddox froze, not in fear, but in dawning recognition. The cameras, the witnesses, the agents closing in. For the first time in his career, the violence he wielded so casually was not being buried under falsified reports or erased by equipment malfunctions. This time, the evidence would live. Agent Nora Alvarez was the first to reach him, her badge flashing as she wrenched his arm behind his back with efficient force. "Detective Cole Maddox," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of both the moment and the law, "you are under arrest for assault on a federal judicial officer, conspiracy to commit murder, and deprivation of rights under color of law." Her words reverberated off the marble, final and inescapable. Maddox twisted, snarling something under his breath, but the agents were ready. They forced him down, the gavel clattering across the floor until it rolled to a stop against Caleb's shackled foot. The boy looked at it, then at Maddox being dragged away, and something shifted in his posture. A spark of belief where only cautious resignation had lived for months. The gallery, still reeling, didn't yet understand what they had witnessed. To them, it was a shocking act of courtroom violence, the kind of scene that would dominate headlines for days. But for Judge Raine, for Agent Alvarez, and for the quiet network of federal investigators who had been working in the shadows, it was something far more important. This was the moment the dam broke. The assault wasn't just an attack, it was the final piece of evidence, the visible, undeniable proof that Maddox's arrogance could not be contained within the boundaries of law. And the timing was perfect. Across the city, at that very second, other federal teams were in motion, executing warrants, seizing files, taking into custody the men and women who had shielded Maddox for years. The gavel strike had been the signal. Every word he had shouted, every movement he had made, was now sealed in the federal record, impossible to dispute, impossible to erase. Judge Raine straightened slowly, a paramedic stepping forward to examine the wound. She waved him off for the moment, her gaze following Maddox as he was hauled toward the heavy courtroom doors. "You've mistaken fear for respect your whole career, detective," she called after him. "But today, you've shown this court exactly why justice must prevail over men like you." Her voice was calm, but inside she felt the gravity of what had just begun. Maddox's attack would ignite a reckoning, one that would stretch far beyond Caleb Turner's case, far beyond Denver, into the heart of a system that had allowed men like Cole Maddox to operate without consequence for far too long. And as the gavel, still stained with her blood, lay on the cold marble floor. The cameras kept rolling. Somewhere, in a secure federal server, the footage was already uploading. In the days to come, millions would see it. They would see the arrogance, the violence, the moment where a symbol of justice became a weapon, and the moment that weapon was used against the very foundation it was meant to uphold. That single act would unravel everything Maddox had built, and it would begin here, in this room, at 9:05 on a bright morning in Courtroom 6A, when a detective's fury collided with a judge's unshakable resolve, and the truth could no longer be hidden. The echo of the gavel's violent strike still hung in the air when the courtroom began to settle back into an uneasy order. Maddox had been hauled away under federal guard, but the reason everyone had been there in the first place, the petition for Caleb Turner, remained at the center of Judge Evelyn Raine's bench. Blood still trickled in a slow, warm line down her temple, but she ignored the sting, focusing instead on the case file spread before her. She knew better than anyone that Caleb's ordeal was not an isolated incident. It was the thread that, when pulled, could unravel years of corruption. Caleb Turner sat at the defense table, his wrists still cuffed, the heavy chain between them rattling faintly when he adjusted in his chair. At 17, he looked older than his years, not in the way of someone who'd had the privilege of early maturity, but in the way of someone who had been forced to carry weight far too soon. His eyes were clear, steady, but there was a guardedness to them, as if he had learned the hard way that even the truth could be turned against him. The orange jumpsuit draped over his narrow frame looked absurd on a boy whose only crime had been waiting for a bus in the wrong part of town at the wrong time. Judge Raine flipped through the petition, the pages worn soft from repeated handling. It had been filed 2 months earlier by Caleb's mother, Danielle Turner, a woman whose determination had carried her through a legal maze designed to exhaust, discourage, and humiliate. Danielle sat in the front row, her back straight, her eyes locked on her son. The manila folder she held was bulging, not just with Caleb's spotless academic record. Straight A's, honor roll certificates, and 3 early acceptance letters from universities, but also with surveillance photos, witness statements, and sworn affidavits she had collected on her own. In those documents was a simple, devastating truth. Caleb had been targeted. According to the official police report, authored, of course, by Detective Cole Maddox, Caleb had been observed participating in gang recruitment activities and acting as a lookout during a coordinated criminal operation. The date and time stamped in Maddox's report told a very different story than reality. The location Maddox described was a narrow alley off East Larimer Street, known for drug activity, but Danielle had produced security footage from a coffee shop miles away, showing Caleb studying for a calculus exam at precisely the same time Maddox claimed he was aiding gang members. It should have been enough to collapse the case immediately. It wasn't. For 8 long months, Caleb had been held without bail. The DA's office insisted on the severity of the charges and the likelihood of gang retaliation if he were released. It was the same script Judge Raine had heard before in other cases involving Maddox, language that sounded official but was hollow when pressed for specifics. What the public didn't know, what Maddox certainly didn't know, was that Judge Raine had already been quietly investigating him for nearly half a year. She had noticed the pattern long before Caleb's case landed on her docket. The same vague charges, the same lack of physical evidence, the same names of confidential informants who could never be produced in court. Her suspicions had deepened when she'd reviewed the case of a 15-year-old named Brian Alston, arrested by Maddox for aggressive posturing during a routine traffic stop. The charge was dropped after body camera footage surfaced, footage Maddox claimed didn't exist, that showed Brian simply asking why he was being detained. In that instance, The footage had been preserved only because a rookie officer had copied it to a personal drive before it could be accidentally deleted during processing. By the time Caleb Turner appeared in her courtroom, Judge Raine had pieced together an arrest roster from Maddox's precinct covering the past 5 years. The racial disparity was impossible to ignore. Over 90% of the juveniles Maddox arrested were Black or Hispanic, yet the neighborhoods he patrolled were statistically diverse. His arrest reports leaned heavily on coded language. Known to law enforcement, frequent presence in high-risk areas, behavior consistent with criminal activity. Phrases that sounded factual but were broad enough to fit anyone Maddox chose to target. And then there was the darker connection, the one that made Caleb's case feel personal, in a way that tightened the muscles in Raine's jaw whenever she thought about it. Caleb had an older brother, Jalen Turner, who had been shot and killed 2 years earlier in what Maddox described as a split-second, life-or-death decision. Jalen had been unarmed. The weapon recovered at the scene had no fingerprints. The official report read like a textbook example of a justified shooting under department policy. But Raine had managed to obtain Maddox's original field notes from that day. They told a very different story. The first line was seared into her memory. Subject appeared to be surrendering when engagement began. The implications were staggering. It meant Caleb's imprisonment wasn't just a random act of overreach, it was deliberate retaliation. Jalen's death had left questions hanging in the air, questions Danielle Turner refused to stop asking. Targeting Caleb was Maddox's way of sending a message. Stop digging, or lose another son to the system. Judge Raine leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting from the file to Danielle, then to Caleb. She thought of the conversations she'd had in her chambers with Special Agent Nora Alvarez from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. Alvarez had been working her own angle, quietly building a federal RICO case that tied Maddox's methods to a broader network of officers, prosecutors, and administrators. Every new piece of evidence, every corroborated witness statement made it clearer. Caleb Turner's trial was not just a legal proceeding. It was a battlefield. Maddox didn't know it yet, but his world was already collapsing. The gavel strike he'd just delivered wasn't the beginning of his trouble. It was the final nail in a coffin Judge Raine had been building for months. Every insult he had hurled, every fabricated report, every manipulated piece of evidence, it was all catalogued, cross-referenced, and ready for federal scrutiny. The courtroom felt heavier now, the earlier chaos distilled into a watchful silence. The public defenders at Caleb's table sat tense, sensing the magnitude of the moment without fully grasping the scope of what Raine was orchestrating. Across the aisle, the assistant district attorney flipped through a thin file that suddenly seemed embarrassingly insufficient compared to the weight of Danielle's manila folder. Raine pressed her fingertips together, leaning slightly forward. "Mrs. Turner," she said, her tone even but carrying across the room, "this court has reviewed your petition and supporting evidence. We will examine the authenticity of the security footage, the timeline provided, and the contradictions in Detective Maddox's report." She allowed the pause to settle, her eyes cutting briefly toward the door Maddox had been dragged through. "Given recent developments, we will also consider additional testimony relevant to the pattern of conduct alleged in your filing." Danielle nodded once, her jaw tight, but her eyes shining with the faintest glimmer of hope. Caleb straightened in his chair, his shackles clinking softly. Point 1 had been the explosion, the assault that would dominate headlines. Point 2, Raine knew, was the fuse. Caleb Turner's case was the origin of everything. If she could prove the charges against him were fabricated, it would open the door to reviewing every one of Maddox's arrests, every shooting, every confidential informant who had never materialized. Outside the courthouse, a dozen reporters waited for sound bites about the attack. They had no idea that inside, a much bigger story was unfolding, one that would reach far beyond a single gavel strike, into the hidden machinery of systemic abuse that Maddox had relied on for nearly a decade. Raine closed the file slowly, deliberately, the sound of the folder snapping shut echoing like the first step in a march. Caleb's case was going forward, not as Maddox had intended, but as the foundation for something that would bring his entire network into the light. In her mind, she could already see the path ahead, and for the first time in years, she knew exactly where it ended. The deeper Judge Raine had gone into Detective Cole Maddox's record, the more the numbers began to feel less like statistics and more like gravestones. Each file she pulled was another life disrupted, another young person branded by the system as something dangerous and irredeemable. In the last 5 years alone, Maddox had arrested 92 juveniles, 78 of them black, 9 Hispanic, and only 5 white. The disparity was not subtle. It was glaring, a scar across the face of a city that prided itself on equal justice under law. Raine had seen racial bias before, but this wasn't just bias. It was a pattern as deliberate as a sniper's scope. On paper, the charges looked varied enough to suggest legitimate policing, conspiracy to commit assault, possession of evidence indicating gang affiliation, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest. But once Raine began pulling the details, the truth was so thin it could barely hold its own weight. Time and again, the arrest reports leaned on the same hollow phrases: aggressive posturing, behavior consistent with gang recruitment, frequent presence in high-risk areas. These were not facts. They were elastic accusations that could be stretched to fit any young person Maddox chose to target. And Maddox chose his targets carefully. Raine noticed his arrests clustered in certain neighborhoods, areas with historically strained relations between residents and police, where distrust was generational and poverty made legal defense a luxury. In those streets, a single arrest, even for a minor charge, could derail a life. A high school junior caught in Maddox's net might miss weeks of classes before their hearing. Grades would drop, part-time jobs would be lost, college applications would be abandoned. And even if the charges were dropped later, as happened in more than half of Maddox's cases, the damage lingered like smoke after a fire. The language in his reports was more than repetitive. It was strategic. Raine had handled enough suppression hearings to know that terms like failure to comply and furtive movements were courtroom gold for officers looking to justify an arrest without hard evidence. Aggressive posturing was Maddox's particular favorite, appearing in 47 of his juvenile arrest reports. What did it mean? Raine had asked herself that question repeatedly, but the reports never clarified. Sometimes it meant standing with arms crossed. Other times it meant walking away from an officer. Once, unbelievably, it meant looking too intently at Maddox during a traffic stop. But the most chilling part wasn't in the words. It was in the outcomes. Of the 92 juveniles Maddox had arrested, only 8 cases went to trial. The rest ended in plea deals or dismissals. In many, the charges evaporated after new evidence came to light, evidence that should have been available from the start. Maddox's arrests weren't designed to hold up in court. They were designed to control, to intimidate, to mark certain families as troublemakers and keep them under the shadow of the law. One name in the files stopped Raine cold. Marcus Yates, age 15. His gang association charge stemmed from being photographed with 2 classmates at a bus stop. The supposed gang colors? The red and white of their school's basketball uniforms. Then there was Alicia Flores, 14, charged with obstruction for refusing to unlock her phone during a street stop, something she was not legally required to do. The charges were dropped 3 weeks later, But the arrest stayed on her record long enough for her to lose her spot on the school debate team. Raine felt the weight of these names pressing on her as she sat in her chambers late at night, the desk lamp casting long shadows over the stacks of manila folders. The numbers told one story, but the photographs inside told another. Mugshots of children, whose faces were a mixture of fear, defiance, and confusion. These were not hardened criminals. These were kids who had been caught in the path of a man who saw them not as citizens with rights, but as tools in his own private system of control. She couldn't ignore the financial angle either. Through sealed subpoenas, the FBI had obtained payment records linking Maddox to 3 private security firms and 2 bail bond companies. The arrangement was as simple as it was sickening. Arrests in certain neighborhoods generated more clients for the bail companies, which in turn funneled consulting fees back to Maddox. The more young men and women he pulled into the system, the more money changed hands. In 5 years, Maddox had pocketed over $400,000 in undisclosed income. And still, the department had promoted him twice during that period. Commendations lined his personnel file, citations for reducing gang activity, for exemplary community protection. The very patterns Raine now saw as evidence of abuse had been celebrated by his superiors as proof of effective policing. The promotions weren't despite his methods. They were because of them. Her mind kept circling back to the Turners. Caleb's arrest fit the pattern perfectly. Vague charges, no corroborating evidence, a location that could be spun as dangerous in a report but was completely benign in reality. But there was an added cruelty in this one. It wasn't random. Caleb's older brother, Jalen, had been one of Maddox's most controversial shootings. Raine had reviewed the case file for Jalen's death, and even through the redacted pages, she could see the telltale fingerprints of Maddox's method. A questionable stop, an escalation based on subjective claims, a weapon conveniently found after the fact. It was retaliation. Plain and simple. Danielle Turner had been outspoken after Jalen's death, filing complaints, contacting reporters, attending city council meetings to demand accountability. Maddox's retaliation wasn't just about silencing her. It was about sending a message to the entire community. Speak up, and your family will pay. Raine leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. The assault that morning had been shocking, but in some ways it had been the most honest thing Maddox had ever done. In that moment of violence, he had shown the same contempt for judicial authority that he had been showing to the Constitution for years. The difference was that now it was on camera, and now it couldn't be buried. She opened her eyes and looked at the wall where her law degrees hung in neat frames. Below them was a corkboard she had started filling with sticky notes, names, dates, patterns, all color-coded to track Maddox's activities. Red for juveniles arrested without evidence, blue for shootings, yellow for cases where charges were dropped. The board was crowded, messy, but the shape of it was undeniable. This wasn't just misconduct. It was a system, a network. Every line of that network pointed back to Maddox, but it didn't stop with him. Supervisors had signed off on his reports. Prosecutors had pursued charges they had to know were flimsy. Internal affairs had cleared him again and again, sometimes in less than 24 hours. Removing Maddox would be a victory, but dismantling the structure that allowed him to operate, that was the real fight. The knock at her chamber door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Agent Nora Alvarez, her face lit with the kind of energy Raine recognized from someone who had just gotten a break in a long investigation. She placed a thick envelope on the desk. "We got it," she said. Inside was the data dump from Maddox's patrol car laptop, uncensored arrest logs, private communications with his supervisors, and most damning of all, his personal notes. Raine slid the papers out, scanning the first page. There it was in Maddox's own words. Focus on high-visibility stops in minority zones. More attention. S'accusers, cha more leverage. The phrase was underlined twice. It was the closest thing to a written confession she'd seen yet. She exhaled slowly, feeling the edges of the moment sharpen. This wasn't just Caleb's fight anymore. This was the foundation for dismantling an entire system of targeted abuse. The pattern was no longer invisible. And now that it had form, she could break it. The first time Special Agent Nora Alvarez had walked into Judge Evelyn Raine's chambers, it had been late on a Tuesday night, the courthouse echoing with the hollow quiet that settles in after the last gavel has fallen. Raine had been bent over a stack of files, her desk lamp throwing a sharp cone of light across the names and dates of Maddox's arrests. The patterns now etched into her mind like scars. Alvarez, with her FBI credentials clipped to her blazer and a manila envelope tucked under her arm, looked like someone who had already walked miles down a dark road and had finally found someone waiting at the same crossroads. 16 months. That's how long Alvarez had been tracking Detective Cole Maddox, not just as a corrupt cop, but as a key player in what she suspected was a multi-state criminal network disguised under the respectable badge of law enforcement. Her Civil Rights Division team had started with whispers, complaints from community advocates in Denver, Pueblo, and Cheyenne, all describing the same pattern. Minority youth pulled into the system on vague charges, evidence misplaced, body cameras malfunctioning. Maddox's name came up again and again, not just as an officer, but as the one training others in his methods. But proving it was another matter. Every time Alvarez's team closed in, the trail went cold. Witnesses recanted. Physical evidence disappeared. Prosecutors declined to file charges, citing insufficient probable cause. Alvarez knew what that meant. Someone with power was sweeping the tracks before they could be followed. That envelope under her arm, though, that was different. She laid it gently on Raine's desk like it was a live explosive. "These," she said, "are the pieces we were never supposed to find." Raine didn't open it immediately. She studied Alvarez's face, reading the tired determination in her eyes. "How bad?" she asked. "Worse than we thought," Alvarez replied, her voice low. "Maddox isn't just running his own operation. He's part of a coordinated ring across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. It's officers, supervisors, even a few prosecutors. They share intel on so-called problem families, manipulate arrest data to justify funding requests, and protect each other from oversight. Your Turner case, it's a nerve we've been trying to hit for over a year." Raine's fingers hovered over the envelope before sliding it open. Inside were photocopied reports, each stamped confidential in the faded ink of officialdom. The first was Maddox's original incident report from the night Jalen Turner was killed, before it had been scrubbed clean for the internal affairs file. Raine's eyes locked on the line that turned her stomach. Subject appeared to be surrendering when engagement began. In the official version, that had been replaced with subject advanced aggressively toward officer position with weapon visible. "God," Raine murmured. "There's more," Alvarez said, pulling out a smaller, separate folder. Undercover recordings. An informant wore a wire during a conversation between Maddox and Captain Russell Kearns, his direct superior. They talk openly about Jalen's death, about planting a weapon, about making sure Danielle Turner stays in her lane. Raine listened, the tinny audio spilling through a small FBI-issued recorder. Maddox's voice was unmistakable, cold, casual, and dripping with the kind of contempt that came from years of thinking nothing could touch him. "Kid thought his grades and his mouth would protect him," Maddox said on the tape. "I made sure he learned respect the hard way, And his mom, she'll shut up now. She'll have to. Kearns laughed, low and approving. By the time the recording clicked off, Raine's grip on the edge of her desk had tightened until her knuckles went white. This wasn't just abuse of power. This was murder, calculated and deliberate, backed by an institutional machine that had no interest in justice. Alvarez slid a third document across the desk, a suppressed witness statement from a rookie officer who had been first on the scene after Jalen was shot. It didn't match Maddox's version, Alvarez explained. He says Jalen had nothing in his hands, that he was backing away, and that Maddox fired without warning. 2 days later, this officer was transferred to a rural post 3 hours away, and his statement was removed from the file. Raine's mind raced. This was more than enough to indict Maddox on federal charges, but she understood the problem. In a system that had protected him this long, dropping all of this evidence at once might allow his network to close ranks, to cut him loose as a scapegoat while keeping the rest intact. What they needed wasn't just an arrest. They needed a public unmasking, something undeniable, something on the record. "We get him in your courtroom," Alvarez said, reading Raine's thoughts as if they'd rehearsed them together. "We get him testifying under oath. You control the questions. We lead him into the lie. Then we play the recordings. The moment he realizes the trap, the whole country will see who he really is." It was risky. Maddox was dangerous even in a suit and tie. But in open court, with his ego on full display, there was a chance he'd react exactly the way they needed him to. Angry, unfiltered, careless. If they timed it right, they could catch the slip that tied him not only to Jalen's death, but to the broader network. And with the FBI running simultaneous operations in other jurisdictions, they could close the net before anyone had a chance to run. Raine leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing in thought. "We'll need him comfortable enough to think he's winning," she said slowly. "That means I keep him talking. Ask about Caleb's arrest. Let him give the same rehearsed nonsense he's been getting away with for years. Then, when the room thinks it's another one of his untouchable days, we open the door." Alvarez nodded. "And when we open it, the whole thing comes crashing down." The plan was set in motion over the next 2 weeks. Alvarez's team coordinated with Raine's staff to ensure federal cameras were installed in unobtrusive positions throughout the courtroom. The sound system was tested to perfection, so the recordings would play clearly for every ear in the room. Warrants were prepped but sealed, ready to be executed the moment Maddox's testimony and the tapes met the threshold for probable cause. Alvarez kept feeding Raine's suppressed material, original case files that never made it past internal review, logs from Maddox's patrol car GPS that contradicted his sworn statements, payment records from private security firms that had benefited from his arrests. Each piece was a brick in the wall they were building around him, a wall that would have no door. By the time Maddox walked into courtroom 6A on that fateful morning, Raine was ready. She had his pattern memorized, the way he leaned back in the witness chair to project confidence, the pauses he used to make his lies sound measured, the subtle digs at defense attorneys to keep the gallery on his side. She knew when to nod, when to frown, when to glance at her notes to make him think she was off balance. Alvarez sat in the back row, her expression unreadable, but her mind working in lockstep with Raine's. Every question was a step closer to the reveal. Every answer Maddox gave was a thread they could pull. And when the moment came, when the first recordings spilled through the courtroom speakers and Maddox's smirk faltered, it would not just be a victory for Caleb Turner's freedom. It would be the public death of a man who had built his power on fear, and the first crack in the armor of a network that thought itself untouchable. In Raine's chambers the night before, Alvarez had said something that stuck with her. "This isn't about taking down one bad cop. It's about making sure the whole machine that built him has nowhere to hide. And in that moment, as Raine prepared to call Maddox to the stand, she understood exactly what Alvarez meant. This wasn't just a trial. This was the opening move in a war that had been waiting 16 months to be fought in the light. From the moment Detective Cole Maddox took the stand in Courtroom 6A, Judge Evelyn Raine knew exactly what she was looking for. Not just the lies, those she could recite by heart, after reviewing his reports for months, but the tells, the little shifts in his posture, the flickers across his face when his narrative started to buckle, the pauses that were just a beat too long. Those tells would be the cracks, and she intended to widen each one until the whole facade collapsed. Maddox sat in the witness chair like it was a throne. He leaned back, shoulders broad and squared, one arm draped over the armrest in a casual claim of space. His uniform jacket was buttoned tight, service ribbons aligned like miniature trophies across his chest. To an untrained eye, he looked composed, confident. But Raine saw the way his right foot tapped, a subtle rhythm under the table, nervous energy looking for an outlet. She glanced once at Special Agent Nora Alvarez, seated unobtrusively in the back row, and received the slightest nod. The cameras were rolling. Every blink, every muscle twitch, every syllable Maddox uttered was being recorded in high definition and streamed in real time to a secure federal feed. "Detective Maddox," Raine began, her voice even, "please explain to this court the specific evidence that justified holding Caleb Turner without bail for 8 months. The question was sharp, but wrapped in silk. Maddox's lips curved into a smirk, the kind that said he'd answered this sort of thing 100 times before. "Your Honor," he said, projecting the deep timbre of practiced authority, "Mr. Turner was identified as a participant in ongoing gang recruitment activity, based on intelligence gathered during a multi-month operation in high-risk areas. His continued detention was necessary to prevent further criminal association and to protect the community." Raine didn't look up from her notes. "Intelligence gathered how?" Maddox hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Through confidential informants and direct surveillance." "Surveillance conducted by you personally?" "Yes. And this surveillance, where and when did it take place?" "East Larimer Street, between the hours of 6 and 8 a.m., on multiple school days in the month of February." Raine set her pen down, lifted her gaze, and let the silence settle. "Are you aware, Detective, that we have security footage placing Mr. Turner in a coffee shop on Colfax Avenue during at least 3 of those dates and times?" The tapping of his foot stopped. His jaw flexed. "I can't speak to what footage you have, Your Honor. What I can say is that our intelligence places him in 2 places at once?" Raine cut in gently. "That would be quite an accomplishment." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Maddox's shoulders stiffened. She moved on before he could recover. "Let's broaden the scope, Detective. Over the past 5 years, how many juveniles have you arrested on gang-related charges?" "I don't have an exact number. A reasonable estimate will suffice." He shifted in his chair. 80, maybe 90. "And of those, what percentage were minorities?" His eyes narrowed. "I don't keep track of race when making arrests." "That's admirable," Raine said smoothly. "But surely you're aware of your department's own statistics, which show 85% of your juvenile arrests were of Black or Hispanic youth. Would you like to explain that disparity?" "I patrol areas with high crime rates, Your Honor. The demographics of those areas are 42% Black, 31% Hispanic, and 27% white," she finished for him, consulting her file. "Yet your arrests reflect a far different breakdown. How do you account for that?" A flush crept up his neck. "I go where the crime is, or where you believe it is." His hands curled into fists on the armrests. I don't appreciate the implication, Your Honor. I'm not implying anything, Detective. I'm examining the record. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The spectators leaned forward. Maddox's confident facade was starting to show hairline fractures. She pressed on. Let's talk about your use of the term aggressive posturing. It appears in 47 of your juvenile arrest reports. How do you define that term? Body language consistent with preparing for violence. In one report, you described aggressive posturing as crossing one's arms while standing still. In another, as walking away from an officer. In yet another, as making prolonged eye contact. Would you say those definitions are consistent? He opened his mouth, closed it again. It's context-dependent. Convenient, Raine replied, her tone still maddeningly calm. Maddox's breathing had quickened, barely perceptible unless you were looking for it. Raine was. She shifted the focus. You also arrested Jalen Turner, Caleb's older brother, 2 years ago, correct? His gaze hardened. That was a justified shooting. I didn't ask about the shooting yet, Detective. I asked about the arrest. He seemed to realize the misstep, but it was too late. Yes, I detained him prior to the incident. And what was the charge? Failure to comply during a lawful stop. Lawful according to whom? His voice rose half a register. According to me, as the responding officer. Raine allowed the silence to stretch, then leaned forward slightly. Detective, do you believe your authority is derived from your personal judgment, or from the law? He gave a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. From the law. But judges who undermine law enforcement make it harder to keep communities safe. And by undermine, do you mean asking questions about your record? I mean enabling criminals by questioning the people who protect this city, he snapped. There it was, a flash of temper, bright and brief, but enough to open another seam. Alvarez's cameras caught it all. Do you consider Caleb Turner a criminal? Raine asked. He was in the wrong place, with the wrong people. The coffee shop on Colfax? The laughter from the gallery was immediate, though quickly hushed by the bailiff. Maddox's mouth pressed into a thin line. Raine's tone softened, though her eyes stayed sharp. Detective, you've served in this city for over 15 years. You've put yourself in dangerous situations. But would you agree that every citizen, regardless of race, background, or neighborhood, is entitled to equal protection under the law? Some communities, he said slowly, don't respect the law enough to deserve equal protection. The words hit the room like a dropped glass. Alvarez didn't even try to hide the way her pen paused over her notebook. Raine let the echo fade before speaking. Are you suggesting, Detective, that constitutional protections should be applied selectively? I'm suggesting, he said, leaning forward now, his voice low and dangerous, that people who refuse to live by the rules shouldn't expect the same courtesy as those who do. And judges who think otherwise are part of the problem. It wasn't a direct threat, not yet, but the gallery felt the undertow. The bailiff shifted his stance. Alvarez's gaze sharpened. Maddox didn't know it, but every decibel of his voice was being analyzed by FBI audio techs for tone, cadence, and emotional escalation. Raw material for a RICO case that wasn't just about what he'd done, but how he'd operated. Raine didn't flinch. Detective Maddox, the problem isn't that you enforce the law. The problem is when you mistake yourself for the law. His nostrils flared. You've got a lot of nerve talking to me like that, Judge. And you've got a lot of history sitting in those files in front of me, she replied, her hand resting lightly on the stack of documents. Documents that now felt like the weight of every family he had ever wronged. The tension was no longer confined to the air between them. It was in the walls, in the way the audience barely breathed, in the sound of the cameras quietly capturing the unraveling of a man who had built his career on fear. Somewhere behind her bench, On a hidden line, a secure signal pulsed to federal headquarters. Proceed to Phase 2. The cracks in Maddox's armor were no longer hairline. They were spreading, and soon the whole thing would shatter. Judge Raine let the silence after Maddox's last outburst hang like a blade in the air. It was the kind of pause that shifts the weight of the room, that makes even the unspoken feel loud. Maddox sat rigid, jaw set, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something quick, like a shadow passing over the sun. Raine had been waiting for that flicker. It meant he felt the ground shifting beneath him, and she was about to make it collapse. "Detective," Raine said evenly, "this court has heard your explanations, your definitions, and your reasoning. Now, I'd like the court to hear your voice, outside of this witness stand, outside of your uniform, and outside of the version of yourself you've presented here today." Maddox frowned, his head tilting slightly, not yet understanding. She gestured to the bailiff. "Please play Exhibit 47. From the speakers embedded in the courtroom walls, a faint static crackled, then cleared into the unmistakable timbre of Maddox's voice. More casual, more unguarded than the one he used in court. "Russ," he said, chuckling, "I told you I'd handle that Turner family. The older one thought he could get smart with me in front of the rookies. Guess he learned his place." The voice of Captain Russell Kearns followed, deep and approving. "And the younger one? I've got him where I want him," Maddox replied, his tone sharp with pride. 8 months in county, no bail, no trial date. By the time he gets out, his grades are shot, college dreams gone. Mom's gonna think twice before mouthing off at council meetings again. A rustle moved through the gallery, quiet, disbelieving, angry. The recording continued, each word a nail in Maddox's own coffin. "If it hadn't been for those damn coffee shop cameras, we'd have nailed him sooner. But it's fine. I planted enough to make it stick. Took care of the body cam footage myself. Nobody's gonna find anything that says otherwise." Maddox's head jerked toward Raine, eyes narrowing. "Your Honor, this is—" She raised a hand, cutting him off. "Detective, you'll have your chance to respond. For now, the court will continue listening." On the recording, Kearns's voice lowered, almost conspiratorial. "What about the other families?" "The list is ready," Maddox said. "Same as always. Anyone who hires those civil rights lawyers, anyone who causes trouble at community meetings. We put them on the watch list, pull them in for anything we can stick. Loitering, resisting, whatever works. Make them spend their savings on bail and legal fees. They'll keep their heads down after that." The air in the courtroom tightened. Maddox's once steady complexion had gone pale, a slow drain of color as realization set in. These weren't anonymous rumors, weren't half-remembered hearsay. This was his voice, his words, his plan. And worse, Raine knew it, Alvarez knew it, and every person in that room knew it was admissible. Raine kept her expression measured, but inside she felt the momentum shifting. "Detective Maddox," she said, "do you deny that the voice in this recording is yours?" His mouth opened, then closed. "I don't recall this conversation," he said finally, his voice tighter now. "That wasn't my question," Raine replied. "Do you deny that it's your voice?" He hesitated, the pause stretching just long enough for the cameras to drink it in. It could have been altered. Raine allowed herself the smallest arch of an eyebrow. "The FBI's forensic audio unit has confirmed the authenticity of this recording. It has not been altered in any way. Are you saying their analysis is incorrect?" Maddox shifted in his chair, suddenly aware of how many eyes were locked on him. "I'm saying—" "Detective," Raine interrupted, her tone like steel under velvet. "This court operates on evidence. You've just heard evidence, in your own voice, describing the planting of evidence, the destruction of body camera footage, and the targeting of private citizens based on their decision to seek legal counsel. Are you prepared to explain these statements? A bead of sweat broke at his temple. He glanced at the gallery, then at Kearns, who sat several rows back, expression unreadable, but posture rigid. For the first time all morning, Maddox's confidence wavered visibly. "I was blowing off steam," he said, forcing a laugh that died in the silence. "Cops talk big sometimes. Doesn't mean we actually do it." Raine's gaze didn't move. "So your testimony now is that you fabricated these statements? That you lied to your superior officer?" "That's not what I'm saying," he snapped. "Then what are you saying, Detective? Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" The question landed like a hammer. Maddox's eyes darted, searching for an exit that didn't exist. The cameras caught it all. The flicker of panic, the tightening jaw, the defensive lean forward as if proximity could replace proof. "Detective," Raine said, her voice dropping into the kind of quiet that carries farther than a shout. "Your words are not just inappropriate. They describe criminal acts. Acts that, if proven true, fall under federal statutes for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. Do you understand the severity of that?" Maddox swallowed hard. "I know what this is," he said, his voice a low growl now. "You're trying to trap me. You and your FBI friend back there think you can break me in my own city. But you don't know how things work here." Raine didn't blink. "On the contrary, Detective, I think we've just heard exactly how things work here. And now, so has everyone else." Alvarez, from her seat in the back, didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even breathe too loudly. But she felt the shift as clearly as if the floor had tilted. This was the moment they had engineered for 16 months. The point where denial became implausible, where the jury of public opinion, those in the room, those watching later, would see Maddox for exactly who he was. "Play the remainder," Raine instructed. The recording rolled on, revealing Maddox and Kearns discussing the payoffs, how certain private security firms funneled cash through consulting fees, how bail bond companies slipped referral bonuses for every arrest that stuck long enough to require bail. They joked about quotas without using the word, about which judges were soft, and which prosecutors could be counted on to rubber-stamp charges. By the time the tape clicked off, the air in the courtroom felt heavier, as though the truth itself had weight. Maddox sat stiff, staring straight ahead, but the pulse in his neck betrayed him. Raine let the silence stretch again, long enough for the gallery to absorb the scope of what they had just heard. "Detective Maddox," she said finally, "this court will recess briefly to allow counsel time to review the recording in full. When we reconvene, you will answer questions about it under oath. And I remind you, perjury in federal court carries its own penalties." She rapped the gavel once. Maddox flinched at the sound. As the bailiff called the recess, Alvarez slipped quietly from the back row, her phone already in hand. Outside the courtroom, agents would be preparing the next step. Warrants unsealed, teams in motion, doors about to be kicked in across 3 states. Maddox didn't know it yet, but the walls weren't just closing in. They were about to cave entirely. In that final moment before she left the bench, Raine glanced at him, not with gloating, not even with satisfaction, but with the unshakable calm of someone who knows the truth is no longer a secret. The recordings were real. They were admissible. And they were the beginning of the end. The gavel's sharp rap still echoed faintly in courtroom 6A when Maddox's composure finally shattered. Up until that point, he had managed, barely, to keep the fury roiling beneath his uniform from spilling over in a way that would seal his fate in the eyes of every spectator. But the recordings, the numbers, the calm precision of Judge Evelyn Raine's dismantling, It was more than just an attack on his career. To him, it was humiliation, the kind he had spent his entire life avoiding, inflicting on others before it could touch him. And now, it was here, in front of a packed gallery, and under the watch of cameras that would play his every twitch on repeat for the nation to see. He stood abruptly, the wooden witness chair scraping hard against the floor. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, but Maddox's eyes were locked on Raine. She sat steady behind the bench, her expression unreadable, her hands resting lightly on the desk as if they weren't just a few feet from a man unraveling. He took one step, then another, each one echoing too loudly in the sudden hush that had swallowed the room. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice low but shaking with fury. "You think this means anything?" "Detective, you will return to the stand," Raine said, her tone sharp but measured. But Maddox wasn't listening anymore. Something primal had taken over, a dangerous mix of rage and the sudden suffocating awareness that the walls were closing in for good. His hand shot forward, fingers wrapping around the gavel at the edge of her bench. In one quick, vicious motion, he brought it down, striking her square in the forehead. The sound was sickening. A hollow crack of wood against bone, followed by a sharp gasp from the gallery. Raine's head jerked back, and for a split second, the room seemed frozen in place. Blood welled just above her brow, a thin crimson line cutting through the pale calm of her skin. That momentary stillness broke like glass. "Federal agents, move!" From the back and sides of the courtroom, men and women in plain clothes surged forward, their movements crisp, rehearsed, and absolute. 2 agents reached Maddox before he could take another step, slamming him against the bench with a force that rattled the wood. His arms were wrenched behind him, steel cuffs snapping shut with a click that rang out almost as loudly as the gavel strike. "You're under arrest," one agent said, his voice clipped. "Charges include assault on a federal officer, conspiracy to commit murder, and deprivation of rights under color of law." Maddox spat on the floor. "You think you can take me down with this circus? You have no idea who you're dealing with." "On the contrary," the agent replied coldly, "we know exactly who you are." Raine, still seated, pressed a folded handkerchief from the bailiff to her forehead. Her breathing was steady, eyes locked on Maddox, not with fear, but with the kind of unwavering focus that made him shift in the agent's grip despite himself. "Detective," she said evenly, "in this courtroom, the truth deals with you." Outside the courtroom, the Operation Alvarez had been orchestrating for over 16 months roared into motion. At precisely the same moment Maddox was cuffed, FBI tactical teams executed coordinated raids across 3 states. In Denver, armored vehicles pulled up outside a suburban home belonging to Captain Russell Kearns. Agents swept through the front door, seizing hard drives, financial ledgers, and unregistered firearms. In Pueblo, a small law office that doubled as a money laundering hub for private security contractors was torn apart for evidence. In Cheyenne, Wyoming, 2 police chiefs were taken from their offices in front of stunned staff, their cell phones bagged and tagged before they even made it to the elevators. Dozens of arrests followed in rapid succession. Officers, prosecutors, intermediaries, each one handcuffed and read their rights as the network Maddox had relied on for protection collapsed in real time. Every raid was timed to eliminate warning. By the time news trickled through local channels, the key players were already in federal custody. Back in Courtroom 6A, Maddox strained against the agent's hold, his face twisted in rage and disbelief. "You won't hold me," he snarled. "Someone will make a call." Alvarez stepped forward from the back of the gallery, her badge catching the light. "Go ahead," she said. "Make all the calls you want. The lines you used to rely on, they're all in custody." His mouth opened, then closed, the realization hitting like a gut punch. For the first time, the swagger that had carried him through years of intimidation and cover-ups faltered. As Maddox was dragged toward the side exit reserved for prisoner transport, reporters outside were already shouting questions into the humid air. Word of the attack on Judge Raine had spread instantly through courthouse staff, and with it, the breaking news that one of the city's most decorated detectives was now a federal defendant. Raine stood slowly, the bailiff still hovering at her side, the handkerchief now faintly stained. She straightened her shoulders, looking out over the gallery. "This court will reconvene in 30 minutes, she announced. "Justice does not pause for violence." The murmur that swept through the room wasn't just approval, it was something closer to awe. In that moment, even with blood on her brow, Raine looked unshakable. Outside, Maddox was loaded into the back of a black federal SUV, his wrists cuffed, ankles shackled. A swarm of cameras caught every second as he was driven away, the sirens cutting through downtown traffic like a warning bell. By nightfall, federal holding facilities in all 3 states were at capacity with members of Maddox's network. Kearns was booked on charges mirroring Maddox's, plus additional counts of racketeering. Prosecutors who had quashed evidence for years were now reading their own names on indictments. And somewhere in the middle of it all, between the raids, the paperwork, and the quiet congratulations passed between agents, Special Agent Nora Alvarez found a rare stillness. She stood in the courthouse parking lot, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the secure line from Washington confirm what she already knew. Phase 3 was complete. The network was broken. The Gavel strike that had begun as an act of desperation would be remembered as the final blow Maddox had ever delivered in uniform, one that sealed his own downfall and ignited a reckoning that spread far beyond the city. Inside her chambers later that evening, Judge Raine sat alone for a moment, the dull ache at her forehead a reminder of the day's violence. She thought of Caleb Turner, still waiting in county for the system to catch up with the truth. She thought of Jalen Turner, whose name would be part of every filing in the case against Maddox. And she thought of the dozens of families whose stories were no longer buried under falsified reports and missing footage. Outside, the courthouse steps were lit by camera flashes and the restless hum of the crowd. Tomorrow, the headlines would call it "The Day the Shield Shattered." But for Raine, it was something else entirely. It was the day the truth stopped whispering and finally roared. The storm that broke in Courtroom 6A did not end with Cole Maddox's wrists in steel. If anything, his arrest was just the crack of thunder before the downpour. In the days and weeks that followed, the investigation exploded outward like a detonation, pulling into the light a network so sprawling and entrenched that even seasoned federal agents paused to take in the scale of it. What had begun with a single habeas corpus petition for a 17-year-old boy now reached into police departments, prosecutors' offices, and private boardrooms across 3 states. By the end of the first week, the FBI's official tally had risen to 72 officers, men and women with badges, patrol cars, and years of supposed service, now in federal custody or under indictment. 9 prosecutors, some of them celebrated in their jurisdictions for tough-on-crime records, were revealed to have buried exculpatory evidence in dozens of cases, often in exchange for quiet favors or outright cash. 3 police chiefs, once untouchable behind layers of bureaucracy and political connections, were booked on charges ranging from conspiracy to obstruction of justice. The evidence was staggering. Financial analysts within the Bureau unearthed ledgers and offshore transfers connecting Maddox's operation to private security firms and bail bond companies that had quietly funneled millions of dollars over the last decade. The scheme was as simple as it was devastating. Officers like Maddox targeted minority neighborhoods, sweeping up residents, often teenagers, on fabricated charges like aggressive posturing, or gang association. Those arrests generated bail, and the bail bond companies collected their fees. Private security contractors, hired by businesses and gated communities fearful of spillover crime, paid bonuses to officers who could keep the numbers up in public arrest reports, regardless of whether convictions followed. The deeper investigators dug, the uglier it became. Internal memos showed coordinated targeting of problem families, those who spoke at city council meetings, filed civil rights lawsuits, or even appeared in local news segments critical of law enforcement. Officers would circulate watch lists in back channels, and anyone whose name appeared on them could expect sudden traffic stops, surprise inspections, or the kind of petty citations that drained savings over time. In one chilling discovery, agents found encrypted messages in which Maddox and his peers discussed teaching lessons to certain individuals. Those lessons often meant beatings during arrest, prolonged detentions without bail, or, at its most extreme, fatal encounters later ruled as justified force. Jalen Turner's death, once just another grainy headline, now stood out as a keystone in the conspiracy. A targeted killing disguised as a split-second decision in the field. The public reaction was immediate and ferocious. News outlets ran back-to-back coverage of the raids and arrests. Social media exploded with footage from Maddox's Gavel strike, paired side by side with the FBI's press conferences detailing the charges. Former defendants came forward with their own stories. Teenagers who had spent months in detention for crimes they didn't commit. Parents who had been bankrupted by bail fees. Entire neighborhoods living under the constant shadow of harassment. The Department of Justice moved swiftly, not just to prosecute, but to rebuild. Within a month, federal oversight teams were embedded in police departments across the implicated jurisdictions. These weren't symbolic observers. They had full authority to review arrests, demand body camera footage, and override decisions that reeked of bias or retaliation. Reforms rolled out in waves. Bail practices were overhauled to prevent the automatic detention of low-level offenders. Mandatory body camera use became law, with strict penalties for tampering or deactivation. Civilian review boards, long relegated to advisory roles, were given legal authority to discipline officers and recommend terminations. Prosecutors' offices faced new transparency mandates, including the public release of non-sensitive evidence logs. Still, the road to recovery was jagged. Officers who hadn't been charged but had worked alongside Maddox found themselves under intense scrutiny, their past arrests combed through case by case. Trust between communities and law enforcement, which had been frayed for years, was now an open wound. Some residents celebrated the arrests. Others feared that removing the worst offenders would simply make room for new ones if nothing truly changed. Judge Raine remained a central figure throughout the unraveling. Despite the scar now marring her forehead, a thin, pale reminder of the Gavel strike, she continued presiding over cases, including those directly related to Maddox's network. Her courtroom became a symbol, a place where fear had not silenced the law. People came not just to watch proceedings, but to witness the steady, deliberate dismantling of the machinery that had once seemed unstoppable. Special Agent Nora Alvarez, though rarely seen in front of cameras, became something of a legend in investigative circles. Her team's 16-month infiltration had yielded a treasure trove of evidence. Wiretaps, undercover recordings, falsified reports traced directly to their authors. She was meticulous in how the case was presented, ensuring that each defendant was tied to specific, documented acts, not just swept into the net by association. That precision, she knew, was what would keep convictions from slipping through the cracks on appeal. In a rare joint press briefing, the FBI and DOJ made it clear. This was not a one-time cleanup. They committed to a 5-year monitoring program in all affected jurisdictions, with quarterly public reports and an anonymous tip line directly to federal oversight. For Caleb Turner and his mother, Danielle, the unraveling of the network was both vindication and grief. Caleb was released within days of Maddox's arrest. Charges dropped with prejudice. He walked out of county jail thinner, quieter, but with a light in his eyes that hadn't been there since the morning of his arrest. Danielle stood beside him on the courthouse steps, holding his hand as reporters shouted questions. Her voice, steady but edged with emotion, cut through the noise. "The truth isn't enough. We have to make sure this never happens again." In the months that followed, that line became a rallying cry for community groups pushing for deeper reform. It appeared on banners, in op-eds, even on the sides of city buses. By year's end, the Maddox investigation was taught in law schools and criminal justice programs as a case study in systemic corruption and the federal response it triggered. Analysts would point to the sheer scale: 72 officers, 9 prosecutors, 3 police chiefs, and call it unprecedented. Activists would point to the financial paper trail and call it proof of what they'd been saying for decades, that justice, when corrupted, becomes just another business. But for those who had lived under Maddox's shadow, the numbers were not the headline. The real story was in the absence of certain fears. Children could walk to school without glancing over their shoulders for squad cars. Residents could attend council meetings without worrying their names would end up on a watch list. And families, for the first time in years, could call the police without wondering if help would come at a price. Still, Raine knew the work wasn't finished. Corruption was not a weed that could be pulled once and gone forever. It was more like a root system, sprawling and hidden, waiting for the chance to grow back. But now, at least, the soil had been turned, the light let in. And in that light, even the deepest rot had nowhere left to hide. The spring air in the city felt different the day Caleb Turner walked across the stage in his graduation gown. It had been just over a year since he'd been released from county jail. Stepping into sunlight he hadn't felt on his face for 8 long months. Now, he stood as the valedictorian of his class, the gold stole of academic honors draped over his shoulders. When his name was called, the entire auditorium rose to its feet. Not just classmates, but parents, teachers, even strangers who had followed his case in the news. The applause wasn't just for his grades or his speeches. It was for survival, for resilience, for proof that truth could still pull someone back from the edge. His valedictory address wasn't polished like a politician's. It was quiet at first, just his steady voice carrying through the microphone. He spoke about nights in a jail cell, about the echo of heavy boots in the hallway, about the fear that tried to turn into resignation. But he also spoke of his mother, Danielle Turner, whose unyielding faith kept the fight alive when the system tried to bury them. And then, with a faint smile, he announced that he had been awarded a full scholarship to study civil rights law, a decision, he said, to make sure no one has to go through what I did without someone fighting beside them. Danielle sat in the front row, tears in her eyes, her hands pressed together as though holding in the moment. She had channeled her grief for Jalen, and the long months of Caleb's detention into something both fierce and enduring: the Jalen Turner Foundation. In less than a year, the foundation had raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, funding legal aid for families targeted by misconduct and creating rapid response teams that could mobilize when someone was wrongfully detained. Its offices, modest but alive with activity, had walls lined with photographs of families they'd helped, each one a reminder that the fight was bigger than any single case. In interviews, Danielle spoke plainly. "The system that took my son and tried to break my other is the same system we're going to hold accountable, every single time." She refused to soften her language for political comfort. People trusted her because she spoke from experience and because she never allowed herself to forget the faces of those still waiting for justice. Judge Evelyn Raine's face had become equally familiar across the nation. The scar above her right eyebrow, a thin, pale reminder of Maddox's gavel strike, was almost always visible in interviews, a mark she never concealed. In speeches at law schools and judicial conferences, she called it a reminder of the day the bench became a battlefield. Her refusal to step down after the attack, her choice to preside over the very cases that dismantled Maddox's network, had turned her into a living symbol of judicial courage. She received invitations to speak from every corner of the country. In Washington, she stood before Congress to testify about the necessity of judicial protections and federal oversight in local law enforcement. In small towns, she addressed community forums, reminding citizens that accountability starts with vigilance, not just in moments of crisis, but in the quiet years in between. People would line up afterward, not for autographs, but to shake her hand, to look her in the eye, to say, "Thank you." Cole Maddox, meanwhile, would never again see a courtroom except from behind bars. Convicted on a staggering array of charges, assault on a federal officer, conspiracy to commit murder, deprivation of rights under color of law, racketeering, he was sentenced to multiple life terms in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The judge presiding over his sentencing described him as a man who turned the law into a weapon against the people it was meant to protect. Prison stripped away his uniform, his shield, his swagger. The name Cole Maddox became shorthand for corruption in law enforcement, cited in legal arguments, documentaries, and journalism classrooms as an example of how unchecked power corrodes everything it touches. In the public imagination, he was no longer the decorated detective. He was the face of one of the largest police corruption takedowns in U.S. history. The reforms triggered by his downfall continued to ripple outward. The Department of Justice's oversight programs brought measurable change, reduced arrest disparities, increased transparency in prosecutorial decisions, and the first civilian-led disciplinary actions in several departments' histories. Where once there had been quiet fear, there was now a watchful kind of hope. For Caleb, life was moving forward, but never without the weight of the past. On the day he left for college, Danielle hugged him so tightly he could barely breathe. "You're not just going to study law," she whispered. "You're going to make it better." He nodded, knowing that his education wasn't just a personal ambition. It was part of a promise, one that began the day his brother was killed and refused to end with his own release. The Jalen Turner Foundation expanded its reach, partnering with national organizations to create a database of misconduct cases and legal resources for at-risk families. Danielle became its public face, but the work was carried out by a team of attorneys, social workers, and volunteers who all understood the urgency of their mission. They knew that even with Maddox gone, there were others like him still out there, waiting for the next chance to exploit the system. Judge Raine continued her work on the bench, refusing offers of political office or national appointments. "My job isn't to move up the ladder," she told a reporter. "It's to make sure the ground we stand on is solid." Her rulings became case law in multiple jurisdictions, strengthening protections against unlawful detention and prosecutorial misconduct. Law students studied her opinions the way soldiers study battle maps. On the first anniversary of Maddox's arrest, the city held a public event on the courthouse steps. Caleb, now a freshman at university, stood beside his mother and Judge Raine. The crowd stretched across the square. Families, students, lawyers, activists, and people who had never met any of them, but understood what the day represented. Danielle spoke first, her voice carrying over the wind. "Justice is not a finish line. It's a road we keep walking, together." Caleb followed, urging his peers to see law not as a distant institution, but as something they could shape. Finally, Raine stepped forward, the sunlight catching the scar above her brow. She looked out at the faces, the cameras, the weight of the moment. "This is not my victory," she said. "It belongs to every person who refused to be silent, who refused to accept that wrong was just the way things worked. We proved that the law can still protect us, but only if we demand it." The crowd erupted in applause, not the polite kind, but the deep, sustained kind that comes when people recognize themselves in the words. As the speeches ended and the crowd began to disperse, Caleb turned to Raine and his mother. "We're not done," he said simply. Both women smiled, not because they thought the fight was easy, but because they knew he was right. And somewhere far from that courthouse, in a cell with no window view, Cole Maddox sat with the knowledge that his name would forever be tied not to the fear he once commanded, but to the movement his downfall had helped ignite. A movement that would outlive him, stronger than any shield, louder than any gavel. The story of Caleb Turner, Judge Raine, and the fall of Cole Maddox is not just a courtroom drama. It is a blueprint for what can happen when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as just the way things are. Over the course of just over 1 year, a single petition for a wrongfully detained 17-year-old exposed a corruption network involving 72 officers, 9 prosecutors, and 3 police chiefs. This was not an accident. It happened because people, citizens, lawyers, journalists, and federal agents paid attention, documented the truth, and refused to be intimidated into silence. The lesson here for every American is clear. Democracy is not self-cleaning. Justice does not survive on autopilot. It takes vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront power, even when that power fights back with every weapon it has. Caleb's release, Danielle Turner's creation of the Jalen Turner Foundation, and Judge Raine's scarred but unshaken presence on the bench prove that change is possible, but only if we demand it and protect it once it arrives. We cannot wait for the right people in government to act. Citizens must be the constant pressure, the unyielding voice, the watchful eyes. If an ordinary mother can take on a detective with a badge and a network of enablers, if a judge can stand her ground against physical violence in the very space meant to uphold the law, then every single one of us can do something. File the records request, attend the hearing, speak at the council meeting, or simply amplify the truth when it surfaces. This story is a reminder that corruption thrives in the dark, but it cannot survive long in the light. That light is us, the people. And if we keep it burning, even the most entrenched abuse will eventually wither. But keeping it burning means staying informed, staying connected, and making sure these stories reach as many ears and eyes as possible. So here's the call. Don't let this be just another story you watch and forget. Be part of the chain that keeps the truth moving. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories that matter. Like this video so it rises above the noise. Share it so someone else sees what's possible when justice is pursued without fear. This isn't just about Caleb or Raine. It's about all of us and the America we choose to live in.